To this point, in our discussion of CSS, we've covered type selectors, which select specific HTML elements based on the HTML tag, and we've talked about class selectors, which allow us to add styling to HTML elements of different types across various types of HTML elements, all using the period as our CSS selector of the class type. Now we're going to talk about ID selectors. Now ID selectors, this is a method for obtaining a reference to an HTML element so that we can style it, but it is a reference to a very specific HTML element and only that HTML element. In other words, it allows us to select one and only one HTML element from our HTML document. So let's go look at our HTML document really quick. In this document, we do have a navigation right here at the top of our page. And if we go to our browser and we look at this, we have our navigation right here. This navigation is an unordered list, just like this list of technologies is an unordered list. Problem is, most navigations we have in websites don't look like unordered lists. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to style this UL, this unordered list, in order to make it look more like a traditional navigation that we're used to seeing in web pages instead of an unordered list. To do that, we're going to use an ID selector. Right here, I do have some pre-written CSS styles for a list item that we could make look like a regular navigation. Now when we put this in here, we'll notice that we are using regular type selectors as well as subtype selectors in here, as well as some pseudo selectors in order to style the unordered list as navigation. As of right now though, using just those selectors, we'll notice that not only our navigation is now styled like a navigation, we also have our regular unordered lists styled as navigation items. And we want to change that. We want to make sure that our regular unordered lists remain regular unordered lists and that only our main navigation up here has this navigation styling. In order to do that, we're going to use that ID selector. So in our HTML, we are going to add the ID attribute to our unordered list, and we are going to call it main nav, standing for main navigation. One thing to keep in mind as we're working with HTML and CSS is that the ID attribute is supposed to be a unique identifier for a very specific HTML element within your HTML document. What this means is that we should not have another element in our HTML document that has the exact same value in its ID attribute. To exemplify that, let's go ahead and look at this H1 that sits above our unordered list. If I were to copy the ID attribute with the main nav value and put that in our H1 as its ID, you will see that we don't get any errors. We don't get any warnings saying that that's not allowed in our IDE. And when we go to our website, we also see no errors, no warnings. Nothing really tells us that we can't do that. So it is your job as a web developer to understand that IDs are to be unique to one and only one element within your HTML document, and that you should not make the mistake of using an ID on more than one HTML element. So with this ID main nav added to our unordered list, if we were to take this attribute right here, the value of the ID attribute, and go to our CSS, we can now use an ID selector in order to make sure that the styling we now see across all unordered lists applies only to this main navigation unordered list in our page. And we do that using the pound sign. So just like our class selector, which we use a period to indicate that we are selecting a class or a group of elements that have this class value, we're going to do the same, but we're going to use an ID selector, which is the pound. And right here we're going to say for a unordered list that has the ID value of main nav, we want this styling to apply to that particular HTML element. So let's look at this again. We're using a type selector to get the HTML element type that we want, and then we are using a compound selector by adding the ID selector using the pound sign and then the value of the element ID in the HTML that we want to use to limit this styling. So here we're saying the unordered list that has the ID of main navigation, let's apply this style to it. Now we're going to want to make sure that we do the same thing to all the styles that have to do with main navigation. So again, we're going to say the unordered list with the ID main nav, let's get all of its child elements that are list items and let's apply this style to it. Do the same thing here. All ULs, well, the UL with the ID main nav, its child list item that also has child anchor tags in it, let's apply these styles to the anchor tags that are inside of the child LIs that live inside of the unordered list that has the ID of main nav. Hopefully this repetition is helping you really understand it. And again, the last one, all the unordered list with the ID of main nav. Let's find all of its children list items, and then inside of those child list items, let's look for all anchor tags, and then let's make sure the hover state of those anchor tags changes the background color to black. Now when we save that and we go back to our HTML, we will see that our standard unordered lists go back to looking just like unordered lists with the dots and then each item in a vertical composition. And then our main navigation up here is now horizontal instead of vertical. And our one link in there, About Us, now has the hover state where it goes to a black or darker gray. And then we have just a regular gray. So when we click on About Us, it takes us to our About Us page. We can go back home. Now we'll see that in our About Us, that style has not been applied to the About Us. And that is because in our About Us, we haven't set this list item yet to have the ID of main nav. So let's head back to our HTML. Let's grab the ID that we're putting on this unordered list. Let's go to our About HTML. Let's find our navigation. Let's add the ID with the main nav. Save that and go back. And now in our About Us, we should have a navigation that looks like what's on our homepage. Now you might ask yourself, well, now I'm reusing that ID main nav in my About page, and I thought it was supposed to be unique. Let's just remember that it is unique within the HTML document that is loaded in the browser, which means between two different HTML documents, just like index.html is separate from about.html, we can reuse those IDs, those HTML IDs, so long as they are in different documents that get loaded into the browser. And now we know how to target a very specific HTML element to apply CSS to it without affecting all other elements of a particular type. Now, ID selectors should be used infrequently and should not be something that you're doing commonly. Usually inside of CSS, we are going to use regular type selectors or class selectors to accomplish the styling of almost all elements within our HTML documents. It's only very specific use cases like this where you have a set of elements or you have a construct in your HTML document that does have a unique ID or only appears once in your document, and you are guaranteeing that it's only there once, that you would use an ID to do that. A main nav is a really good example where you might use an ID selector in order to very specifically style that particular element in your HTML document. If you don't have a use case like this, you're going to use a regular class selector or you're going to use element selectors, and you're going to use compounds of those in order to style elements in your page. And we'll get to compound selectors later on.